Okay, the hearing will come to order. The committee has convened this hearing to discuss the state of the military health system. We hope to shine a light on the challenges facing that system and begin working towards solutions. Our witnesses are experts in the field of military medicine. Dr. Douglas Robb is a retired Air Force Lieutenant General and the former director of the Defense Health Agency, DHA. Dr. Paul Friedrichs is a retired Air Force Major General and the former Joint Staff Surgeon. And Dr. Jeremy Cannon is a retired Air Force Colonel and trauma surgeon who currently serves on the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. I look forward to their testimony. I want to hear their recommendations about what Congress and the Department of Defense should do to provide long-term stability to the military health system. Military medicine often follows a familiar but regrettable cycle. During peacetime, medical teams focus on the treatment of ordinary illnesses. When conflict erupts, military medicine is frequently caught unprepared, resulting in unnecessary casualties. This interwar erosion of our unique military medical skills is known as the peacetime effect. To disrupt the peacetime effect, Congress enacted sweeping reforms of the military health system. These reforms, now nearly a decade old, were designed to refocus military medicine on its primary purpose, combat casualty care and medical readiness. We elevated the Defense Health Agency to a combat support agency and tasked it with administration of all military hospitals and clinics, relieving the military departments of that mission. The goal was to have the military services focus exclusively on the medical readiness of their forces. These ideas were recommended by an independent bipartisan commission embraced by Pentagon leadership and signed into law in 2017. Unfortunately, opponents of these reforms have delayed implementation and undermined the effectiveness of the legislation. For example, in 2019, the military departments implemented drastic cuts to military medical personnel on the faulty assumption that it would be easy for DHA to hire civilians to take their places. This assumption was misguided, which became evident during the COVID pandemic. During that crisis, the existing national physician shortage accelerated. To this day, private sector health systems seek out and hire away doctors from the military, not the other way around. We've all seen this in our states. In 2020, Congress ordered a halt to any additional military medical reductions, but it was too late. A significant number of reductions had already occurred, severely reducing the capability of military hospitals. In many locations, the private sector was unable to handle the additional patients, sending more service members to private sector care. This has proven more expensive and has sapped the military doctors' experiences that are vital to maintaining proficiency. Even worse, DOD has refused to request adequate funding for DHA, which would allow DHA to staff adequately and equip its hospitals and clinics. Since 2015, the budget for military hospitals has decreased by nearly 12%. The water damage at Walter Reed this January is an example of the antiquated infrastructure that military medical teams work with around the world. In addition to the problems I've just explained, I would like our witnesses to highlight how bureaucratic delays within the Department of Defense have prevented the military health system from preparing for the next potential conflict. Combat casualty care is the primary purpose of the military health system. When service members are exposed to danger or are injured, they need to know that they will receive the best care possible. We know that troops in combat are more comfortable taking the risks necessary to accomplish their mission if they have confidence in military doctors. We cannot go back to the way things were before 2017. We must stop scapegoating the Defense Health Agency. The Department of Defense must request adequate resources to ensure the department's hospitals and clinics are properly staffed and equipped. This is the best way to ensure the military health system is ready for the potential demands of large-scale combat operations in the future. I thank the witnesses for being willing to testify, and I now recognize Ranking Member Reed for his remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Wicker, and welcome to our witnesses, General Douglas Robb, General Paul Friedrichs, and Colonel Jeremy Cannon. Each bring important perspectives from their extensive careers in military medical fields. We are fortunate to have such a distinguished panel before us. Throughout history, military medicine has often represented the leading edge of modern healthcare. Many of the life-saving practices common in today's emergency rooms and clinics were born out of necessity from the battlefield hospitals of the Civil War, World War I and II, Vietnam, and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Professional expert healthcare, both in combat and peacetime, is a vital component of our military. Our servicemen and women and their families deserve nothing but the best in this regard. I am concerned that our military healthcare system will be challenged to meet the demands of a potential large-scale future conflict, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. We have seen the terrible challenges of healthcare in austere environments like the front lines of Ukraine, where supplies and medics are often cut off from the troops in contact. These risks would be compounded in the Indo-Pacific, where contested logistics and the tyranny of distance would be major factors. Congress has dedicated considerable attention to reforming the military health system in recent years, with an eye toward any potential future large-scale conflict. The primary objective of these reforms have been to improve combat casualty care, assure quality medical care for service members and their families, and ensure that military medical professionals are able to deliver the world's best care on the battlefield, at field hospitals, and at medical centers and clinics. However, until relatively recently, the military health system was inadequately designed to meet these missions. For decades, the individual military branches managed their own military treatment facilities, and the Defense Health Agency, or DHA, was tasked with managing Defense Department health care via civilian providers. This system was hampered by unnecessary complexity, a lack of standardization, inefficiency, and redundancy in the system, and inflated costs. The military health system was too focused on beneficiary care, while insufficient attention was paid to combat casualty care. To address this, the fiscal year 2017 National Defense Authorization Act included provisions restructuring much of the system. This legislation transferred responsibility for operating the military treatment facilities entirely to DHA. This change was intended to allow the military services and surgeons general to focus on medical readiness for the force and its healthcare providers. Unfortunately, implementation of this legislation has been difficult. The military services have not implemented the changes readily, and they have failed to staff the treatment facilities with the military personnel needed to provide timely care. The Department of Defense made progress to break through the inertia in 2023 when it issued a memorandum with specific directions to stabilize and improve the military health system, to include adequate manning of military treatment facilities. And this effort marked a major milestone in modernizing the system. More work remains to be done, and I hope that the Trump administration will continue the momentum in this area. During today's hearing, I would ask for our witness views on the key challenges remaining for successfully reforming the military health system and how Congress can help equip the department and our warfighters with the medical support needed for any future conflicts. Thank you again to our witnesses, and I look forward to your testimonies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, we'll begin with 5-minute testimonies from each of our distinguished witnesses. Lieutenant General Robb, you are recognized.
Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Reed, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify on the urgent need to restore and sustain our military medical readiness in the face of large-scale combat operations. And thank you both for your, what I would believe is spot-on comments. So thank you very much. Just a little background on where my perspective of the military health system originates from. I started my military career as a boots on the tarmac operational flight doc, both stateside and overseas. I've served at the Air Force Squadron, Hospital, Clinic, and Medical Center commander positions and at the headquarters level. I've also had the honor and privilege to serve our joint forces as a U.S. Central Command Surgeon, Joint Staff Surgeon, and as the first director of the Defense Health Agency. Moving forward, a refocus on our ability to support large-scale combat operations, I believe, will require a recalibration of current and future resources to support large-scale casualty flow from the battlefield or the sea battle to definitive care, rehabilitation, and eventually reintegration. All this in the face of incremental pressures from OSD, OMB, and the military departments, resulting in a decade plus of flatline, actually declining, defense health program budgets, personnel reductions, erosion of our mission-critical military treatment facilities, and intense competition for quality healthcare professionals with the private sector. One of the key military health system organizational elements in support of the military health system strategy is the evolving and maturing Defense Health Agency, designated as a combat support agency, that was established over a decade ago. Recently, the DHA's justification, and specifically the DHA's designation as a combat support agency, has been challenged and questioned. In 2011, the Deputy Secretary of Defense issued a memo titled Review of Governance of Model Options for the Military Health System that was driven by the department's significant growth in healthcare costs. Fast forward a decade later, sound familiar? The Task Force on Military Health System Governance Reform was then established, and this is key, that included co-chairs from the Joint Staff, OSD, and FLAG and SCS representation from the Joint Staff, OSD, PNR, CAPE, and Comptroller, and the Service Surgeon Generals for a total of 9 voting members. And I think it's also too important to recall the task force overwhelmingly recommended a Defense Health Agency organizational model with a final vote of 7 for the Defense Health Agency, 1 for a unified medical command, and 1 for what then was called a single service model. The recommendations were briefed through both Joint Staff and actually through 2 chairmen, and Office of Secretary of Defense, and actually through 2 Deputy Secretary of Defenses, with the Defense Health Agency construct signed off by the DepSecDef with the chairman's support. Another decision that has come into question in recent years was the designation of the Defense Health Agency as a combat support agency. This designation was initiated by the Director of the Joint Staff with the chairman's concurrence when reviewing the proposed DHA organizational structure and the relationships with both the chairman and the OSD. The CSA designation was then codified. Now, a decade later, do I still believe the original analysis and the recommendation to stand up a Defense Health Agency as a combat support agency remain valid? And the short answer is yes. But does a recalibration of the Defense Health Agency supporting relationship with its combat support agency responsibilities to the supported entities of the military departments and the joint forces need to be readdressed? And again, I would say yes. I share with you several lines of effort that I believe are essential as we strive to further achieve a more tightly integrated military health system to support our national military strategy and our national security strategy. Number 1, reemphasizing with clear articulation and execution of the Assistant Secretary of Defense's of Health Affairs authority, direction, and control of the Defense Health Agency. Number 2, I believe we need to establish a direct organizational linkage at the Defense Health organizational structure level with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the combatant commands through the Joint Staff Surgeon to ensure that the responsibilities are prioritized with the DHA's execution. And finally, NDA 19 directed the department to establish joint force medical requirements process to synchronize the military health system's already established joint operational requirements governance process. And I think that's key, that the medics need to play with the joint staff's process for determining requirements. In closing, I would like to thank you and look forward to support you in assisting the military health system's ability to accomplish our mission of ensuring a medically ready and a ready medical force in support of our military departments and combatant commands through the provision of care to our 9.5 million beneficiaries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robb. Major General Friedrichs.
Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Reed, and members of the committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here.
I had the opportunity in my very last briefing to some members of this committee in May of 23 to give you a classified assessment of MHS readiness. And I will start with a recommendation that if you've not had an update since May of 23, I would implore you to schedule that so that the Joint Staff Surgeon can give you the most current classified assessment, because what we will provide today is an unclassified assessment. Second, I'll give a disclaimer that the views that I express are my own, not those of any organization with which I've been affiliated. I've provided a detailed written statement to you, and I would respectfully ask that that be entered into the record of this hearing.
All of the statements will be added to the record at this point without objection.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I have two disclaimers. The first, this is my family business, so I will speak both from my experience and because my dad served in the Navy, 98, still alive at the end of World War II, multiple other relatives in the Navy. My wife is a former Army physician who now works for the VA. We're very proud that one of our children is a Marine. I care about this not only because of all of the others, but because this is what my family has done for generations. My second disclaimer, like General Robb, is I've had the privilege of serving our country now for 39 years. And the majority of those years I've spent in joint roles. Congress got it right in 1986 with the Goldwater-Nichols Act, but the one thing I wish you would change is to include medics as part of the military. As long as we preserve this false narrative that the military health system is separate and not covered by the same expectation of jointness as the rest of the military, we're going to continue to have these fruitless, bureaucratic buffoonery actions that distract us from taking care of patients. I encourage you to treat the military health system like a part of the military. We've had tremendous accomplishments over the last 20 years with the lowest rate of deaths among injured ever seen in conflict, and we should be incredibly proud of that. When I deployed, I had what I needed when I needed it, Air-Evac available. I flew Air-Evac missions. I operated on casualties. I never lacked for what I needed. I cannot offer you the assurance that my successors will have that same environment in the next conflict. And I'm grateful that you're holding this hearing today. I have several very specific recommendations. First, as I touched on before, we must prioritize the patient over the patch. Put a nail in the heart of this discussion about reorganizations and what the role of the military health system actually is. We need to commit, and we need your help in the next NDAA, to clearly articulate, just as both the chairman and the ranking member said, the military health system exists as part of the military to ensure that we deter those who might seek to harm our nation and defeat them if they try to. The military's role is to take care of the human weapons system. The healthcare benefit delivery is part of how we do that and part of a commitment that we make, but I implore you to address that in the next NDAA. As I said before, I think that you got it right with Goldwater-Nichols, and I would encourage you in the next NDAA to clearly articulate that you view the military health system as part of the military and not exempt from the requirements that the rest of the military faces. A joint casualty stream requires a joint casualty care team. That seems relatively straightforward, and yet that is still something that we are arguing over, whether medical units should be interoperable, whether they should have the same equipment or the same training. The answer is yes. Look at Israel, look at almost every other country with a large military. They've already made those changes, which you rightfully began and appropriately began in 2017. We don't need another reorg. What we need is execution of the vision that you laid out. The next point that I'd bring up is resourcing, and both the chairman, the ranking member, and Dr. Robb touched on this. Healthcare is not cheap. The mistaken belief that somehow military medicine can be done at a lower cost than in the civilian sector and be ready for conflict is just that. It's a mistake, and it's a discredit to those who state that they care about our patients. Finally, I'm deeply concerned about our growing vulnerability to biological threats. The decisions to take down our overseas partnerships to build better biosurveillance, the decisions to take down research and biological threats, the decisions to take down multiple other programs that we had built as a result of the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which President Trump signed in the first administration and President Biden updated.
put us at greater risk, and we must continue to address those risks of the evolving biological threats, both naturally occurring and deliberate threats. The confluence of AI, biotechnology, and compute is dropping the bar dramatically for biological threats. We should be working on mitigating that. I thank you again for the opportunity to be here and for your interest in this.
Thank you, Dr. Friedrichs. Colonel Cannon.
Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Reed, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. These comments are my own and do not reflect an official position of my employer, Penn Medicine, or of the Hoover Institution, where I currently serve as a veteran fellow. As a practicing trauma surgeon, I've cared for injured warfighters in both Iraq and Afghanistan. I've directed the DOD's only Level 1 Trauma Center. And now I lead a Penn Medicine Navy partnership for trauma training. I know firsthand what it takes to save lives on the battlefield and what happens when we fail to sustain medical readiness. I want to start by sharing the story of the unexpected combat casualty survivor that I took care of in 2010. Note, I'll use a pseudonym throughout my comments for patient privacy. U.S. Army Sergeant Eric Ramirez was on patrol in Afghanistan when a sniper's bullet tore through his chest just above his body armor. His injuries were truly catastrophic, but thanks to decades of investment and innovation in combat casualty care, a military trauma team pulled him up out of his certain death spiral by placing him on heart and lung bypass on the battlefield. Days later, I had the honor of caring for Sergeant Ramirez in the U.S. as he reunited with his family. This unequivocal display of medical supremacy was not accidental. It was built on years of research, training, and policy reforms, but I fear that if Sergeant Ramirez suffered this same injury now, he would die a preventable death on the battlefield. Today, only 10% of military general surgeons get the patient volume, acuity, and variety they need to remain combat ready. We're actively falling into the trap of the peacetime effect. Meanwhile, as the MHS struggles, our enemies continue to grow stronger. Projections estimate a peer conflict could produce as many as 1,000 casualties per day for 100 days straight or more, a scale not seen since World War II. Neither the current MHS nor the civilian sector can absorb this impact. What's more, many of these patients will have survivable injuries, yet 1 in 4 will die at the hands of an unprepared system. How can we meet this looming threat? First, we must clearly articulate the root problem of our failed readiness efforts. No one in DOD truly owns combat casualty care. In 2017, the Joint Trauma System, or JTS, was codified in law. This committee must now strengthen the statutory language to affirm that JTS owns combat casualty care and to provide this precious resource with both top-down authority and bottom-up support. Then we must push the MHS to refocus on forward-deployed care, the one thing that only military medicine can do. For this, I recommend 3 lines of effort. First, clinical training. In order to train the way we fight, we must establish 5 to 6 high-volume military treatment facility centers of excellence for both trauma and burn care. These centers must undergo civilian accreditation and fully integrate into a national trauma and emergency preparedness system. We also need to strengthen and expand our military-civilian partnership sites where military trauma teams manage critically injured patients on a daily basis, like my partnership program at the University of Pennsylvania. To do so, Congress must reauthorize PAPA and fully appropriate the Mission Zero Act. Second, combat casualty research. To succeed on complex future battlefields, DoD medical research must refocus on pre-hospital care, team training, bleeding control, battlefield blood transfusions, regenerative medicine, and long-term outcomes. In order to fully understand the effects of battlefield treatments, we must link DoD trauma registry data with VA records. Finally, we need a unified military trauma system strategy. We must urgently develop and implement a whole-of-society roadmap aligning military, VA, and civilian systems for for both peacetime readiness and large-scale combat operations. The bottom line, if we maintain the status quo and enter a peer conflict unprepared, we will condemn thousands of warfighters to preventable death. Without urgent intervention, the MHS will continue to slide into medical obsolescence. To restore the medical supremacy that saved Sergeant Ramirez, we must act now. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, our warfighters and our nation deserve medical supremacy. Thank you for your time. I look forward to the comments.
Thank you, Dr. Cannon, and I commend each of you for your excellent testimony. Let me just get a quick answers here from all three of you. I think what I'm hearing from all three of you is that this is going to require more than simply good management of what we have on the books now. Each of you is recommending changes in the statute that need to come in this coming NDAA. Is that right, Dr. Robb? And yes. Dr. Friedrichs?
Yes, sir.
And Dr. Cannon?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Now let's talk about military surgeon readiness for combat care. There was a study out in 2021. It found that the population of military general surgeons meeting necessary readiness standards decreased from an already low 17% in 2015 to about 10% in 2019. We'll let all three of you take a brief chance at answering this. Why is this happening, and what specifically can DOD do to reverse this trend? And we'll just start with Dr. Robb and go down the table.
We'll try to share different perspectives here.
Okay.
I think it comes back to the system to be able to resource the requirements that we need. And so, for example, if you want to look at, Dr. Cannon referred to the 5 to 8, what we call critical military treatment facilities. In order for us to provide higher volume, high acuity care, they need to be resourced. And I think that's the challenge that we all face right now is what's that strategic reserve with our military treatment facilities? And then how you augment that with the VA and the Department of Defense partnerships, and then how do you augment that with the military surveillance?
Is that what he called this, the centers of excellence?
So I would call them, that's one way to call them, but coming from the airlifter world, in fact, General Friedrichs and I would both say, follow the casualty flow. And the casualty flow comes in from Indo-PACOM to primarily will be coming to 2 or 3 military treatment facilities. From Southcom, they will be coming into the National Capital Region. And then from Europe, CENTCOM, and AFRICOM, they will be coming into primarily National Capital Region and with a pop-off at Portsmouth. Okay, Dr. Friedrichs, is this 10% number a concern? And why do we have a 10% of eligible, 10% of military surgeon readiness?
Mr. Chairman, it absolutely is a concern. When I did my training in the military, I trained at the old Wolford Hall that was a level 1 trauma center. I took care of trauma patients because it was a 36 on, 12 off schedule every other night. Or I took care of vascular surgery patients, or I took care of cardiothoracic patients. We've de-scoped our facilities to the point that they take care of low acuity community hospital patients, not trauma patients. So I would reiterate the point that you've heard all three of us make. We need our key hospitals to be level 1 trauma centers in partnership with the American College of Surgeons and the communities in which they're located. But to do that, we must address the elephant in the room, and that's resourcing. The medical inflation rate on average since 1938 is 5.1% per year. And the military has seen a net 12% reduction in funding. There is no way to fix these problems if the military health system is viewed as a bill payer and not something worth investing in. The second point that I would make is we've got to reiterate the intent that you and the ranking member mentioned. I spent 4 years as the Joint Staff Surgeon. Almost every meeting in which I participated in that role focused on roles and responsibilities and patches, not on patients. Please, again, I implore you, kill this narrative that somehow there's a belief that we can unwind things and go back to the good old days. We need to go forward towards a more integrated system that focuses on patient care and, as you said, on readiness, not continuing to focus on bureaucratic buffoonery.
Dr. Cannon.
Mr. Chairman, it's shocking, astonishing, and awful, and it has to be reversed. That 10% number results from inadequate, actually grossly inadequate patient numbers, volume. They're not doing the cases, they're not doing the procedures, they're not doing what they were trained to do. And that's because they don't have the patients in the facilities. They're, in many cases, not designated or verified trauma centers. So they're scrounging around trying to get cases, and it's been, frankly, an uphill climb. So we've got to provide them the patients, the cases, the experience to write that 10% number.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Senator Reid, you're next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, thank you for your excellent testimony. In the 2023 memorandum by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, one of the key points, I believe, is the direction to attract beneficiaries to the MTFs, which would increase the patient flow, increase the demands on physicians, et cetera, and also save money, they believe. Dr. Friedrichs, your sort of response to this approach?
I strongly support the vision that Deputy Secretary Hicks laid out, which is very similar to the vision that Deputy Secretary Norquist laid out in the previous administration and almost every administration prior to that. Again, to do that, we must have resources. I'll offer one other option, which I think you've heard all three of us touch on briefly. Every single patient in the Veterans Health Administration started in DOD. I had the great privilege of commanding the DOD VA joint venture facility in Anchorage, and I can tell you that when the patient walked in the door, they were taken care of by a joint team. It was far more efficient than building duplicative adjacent facilities. Instead, we built integrated adjacent facilities. There's a $10 billion unfunded recapitalization bill in the DOD, a $100 billion unfunded recapitalization bill in the VA. There are real opportunities to bring those higher acuity patients from the VA into the DOD facilities or bring DOD medical personnel into the VA facilities so that we are not wasting money on duplicative buildings and instead focusing our resources on the patients who need our care.
Thank you. And General Robb, or Dr. Robb, or both, do you think the military healthcare system is adequately focused on the combat-related medical capabilities? I've heard comments by all the panel suggesting that they're diverted into things that are not effective in the combat situation.
Well, I think, in fact, I would kind of like to challenge the misnomer that there's a separation between care beneficiaries and medical readiness. And I would argue the way that we get our skills, primary care, specialty care, and just as important, our allied health, pharmacy, x-ray techs, logistics. We get that by taking care of our beneficiaries. And so what I think is so important is that we but we care for our patient population to best achieve a medically ready and a ready medical force. And what I think is really important is that, again, we have to create a capability. It has to be an enterprise approach. And when we talked about, again, I'll go back to the point of follow the casualty flow, and you look at those critical hospitals that we believe are important, we must staff those. And we must staff those to the fullest extent possible. You can't reattract patient care into our MTFs unless you staff them. And I think that is what is key. If I can't get an appointment, then I can't get an appointment. And so that's what is key. And so if you talk with Walter Reed, for example, they may have enough surgeons, but for various reasons, the support staff doesn't exist, so they don't have the throughput that they need for surgical cases. The caseload is there. So what I think we need is an enterprise approach on how do we resource, okay, the full spectrum of support for our critical care hospitals and then make up the delta with our military VA partners and with our military civilian partnerships.
Thank you. Dr. Cannon, your comments, please.
Senator, I think it's vitally important to have highly functioning premier medical centers that we can be proud of, that our surgeons and other specialists and allied health members want to be a part of. Right now, many of these facilities are shells of what they used to be. You heard about Wilford Hall. That was an amazing facility that did so much good for so many decades. The new incarnation, Brooke Army Medical Center, the San Antonio Military Medical Center, is also amazing, but it's sort of out on the vanguard by itself. We need other premier flagship centers, and I think we can do it. We've got the pieces in place, but we've got to commit to keeping the combat casualty at the center of our focus and make it happen.
Thank you. My time is just about expired, but a yes, no, or perhaps answer. I am concerned about the ability to mobilize medical professionals for a all-out fight. Is that a valid concern? Yes or no, please?
Yes.
It is the billion-dollar concern. The Israelis have proved that. And we have a shell game right now with our Guard and Reserve and civilian facilities. We're going to pull them out, deploy them, and assume that civilian facilities, which during COVID required 70,000 military medics to take care of a surge in demand, instead lower their staff and then take care of a surge in demand. The math doesn't work, even for a Louisiana public school grad.
Dr. Cannon, go ahead and answer the question.
Yes or no?
Take the time.
I agree. It's a concern.
All right, Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate the information that you're giving us and also the concern you have with the direction that we aren't headed yet. In the NDAA for FY 2020, a pilot program was established to assess the National Disaster Medical System, the NDMS, and hopefully that it would increase not just capability, but also capacity within that. In a conflict, we've touched on that already. We have to be able to quickly disperse and absorb casualties throughout the United States. Dr. Friedrichs, why is it so important for the NDMS to maintain this surge capacity?
Senator Fisher, first, thank you for the role that you and your colleagues from Nebraska played in championing this and highlighting this. It's important because the military health system does not have the capacity to care for every casualty coming back. We don't have the capacity to care for the people in peacetime right now. So to think that somehow we can do this on our own is another mistaken belief. During the Cold War, we recognized that if our nation went to war, we would go to war together, and that we would do it with an integrated system with the DOD, the Veterans Health Administration, and civilian partners. We must rejuvenate the NDMS, not let it continue to atrophy.
So what's the next step in this pilot program?
So the next step is to make this not a pilot program, but to reiterate that this is indeed the intent of Congress, that the NDMS is the framework in which we integrate our ability to deal with either surges in military patients or, in the event of a natural disaster, surges in civilian patients. But that is the framework. A subset of that are the RESPECT centers, which you're very familiar with, the regional emerging special pathogen centers that are designed to take care of patients exposed to or treated, infected with high consequence infectious diseases. And another subset of that is the trauma system that Dr. Cannon so nicely described. We need your help to articulate in law that we must work as a nation and as a team. We're short 300,000 nurses nationally. The projections are we will be short 130,000 doctors by 2035. There is no way that we can do this individually. We must do it together, and I urge you to codify the NDMS pilot and make that the intent moving forward.
Dr. Cannon, Dr. Robb, anything to add on that?
Senator, I would just advocate for what my colleague, General Friedrichs, just said, but we need to put our foot on the gas. We don't have 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. We need the solution really now.
Dr. Robb?
Yeah, I concur with both their comments. And going back, the fact that we we dual purpose these assets, these expensive assets, to solve problems both on the military and the civilian sector, but they're mutually synergistic. So absolutely, we need to press forward.
Thank you. Dr. Friedrichs, you mentioned the University of Nebraska Medical Center and working with an academic institution. Can you explain to the committee the benefits of those partnerships with academic institutions in particular and what that can yield for the military health system?
Thank you very much, Senator Fisher. So the first benefit is we share and exchange information. University of Nebraska has established, without a doubt, one of the premier programs for treating casualties or patients who are exposed to highly contagious infectious diseases. And they've got remarkable on-site training, which they built in partnership with the United States Air Force. This is a great example of a military-civilian partnership in which the exchange of ideas improves care both for military and civilian patients. But the other thing that we can learn from our civilian partners is something that I offered to the committee to consider. The CHIP-In Act, which was originally passed to allow for blending of funding to build new VA facilities, should be expanded to include the DOD. We cannot afford to keep building duplicative facilities, and the CHIP-In Act was a great way to allow the blending of federal, state, local, and philanthropic funds so that we can most efficiently care for this diverse patient population. And again, I commend the University of Nebraska for the pioneering work that they've done in showing what a good MILSA partnership looks like.
Thank you for the shout out on the CHIP-In Act. That bill was written in my office, so thank you very much. Dr. Cannon, as a professor of surgery, do you have anything to add on that?
I would just comment that these MILSIV partnership sites can be incredible assets for force generation, for building up that next generation, those future leaders in surgery and other combat relevant specialties. And these are epicenters of academic excellence where we can truly inspire that next generation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. It seems to me that the state of Nebraska must have excellent representation in the U.S. Congress. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you all very much for being here today. Dr. Robb, you discussed the impact of declining budgets on the Defense Health Agency. As a former director, can you talk about how late budgets and operating under continuing resolutions, continued budget uncertainty affects the readiness of the military health system?
When I look back at, in fact, I'll go back in history because I was part of that. When we initially stood up the Defense Health Agency in response to the perception that we had a 10% of the 10% of the DoD's overall budget, and then we moved. And then I fast forward to 12 years later, and now we're actually less than 10%. And I look at, we were meeting most of our, not quite, but most of our demands back then. But as I've watched, we've had increasing combatant command requirements with a decreasing defense health program. And what that has forced us to do is we've seen a couple of challenges, and there are multiple things going on, but the military departments have, their end strength has gone down. And the way we man those hospitals is with a certain percentage of military members. And as Dr. Friedrichs said, you just can't buy healthcare professionals off the streets. And so when we cut the end strength, okay, then we apportion this care downtown, and then that increased TRICARE budget, which then we have to pay with Bag 1 money, which is direct care money, to pay direct care. So now we actually have a internal shrinking of our budget. So it has been challenging for the Defense Health Agency to manage a set of military treatment facilities with that to be the current business process.
And is it fair to say that budget uncertainty exacerbates that problem? Continuing resolutions exacerbate
absolutely.
That
Yes,
problem.
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Dr. Friedrichs, you mentioned the National Guard. And one of the things that I know that the National Guard, as we all know, is assuming a greater role in actual deployments and picking up work for the regular military. I could probably say that more eloquently, but they're taking on a much bigger role than they did 30 years ago. And yet the National Guard doesn't have the same coverage for health care that our regular military does. Despite the challenges that you all have identified, it's even a greater problem for the National Guard. Can you speak to what we got to be thinking about as we're thinking about how do we ensure that the Guard actually has the health care they need so that they're ready to go if they're called to deploy or called into combat?
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. And I'll start, if I may, first with your premise that there's an increasing demand signal. The decision to take down the United States Agency for International Development and most of its capabilities is almost unquestionably going to drive more demand on the Department of Defense. USAID provided countless services for disaster response and for work with allies and partners around the world.
And for global health.
And for global health, and for biosurveillance and many other roles. In the absence of USAID, we either agree that when Americans are caught in a disaster, they're on their own, or we're going to turn to the only other organization that has those kind of capabilities, and that's DOD. So we should, I'm afraid, expect to see more demand on DOD as a result of those changes. To your point about healthcare preparedness, when we look back at why people shortly after deployment have to be pulled off the line, interestingly, it's dental care, primarily among the Guard and Reserve, who don't have ready access to that. I think if we are serious about a smaller force that must be ready on a moment's notice, we are going to have to address how to ensure that force is ready, when needed, to go forward. And that's medically ready, as well as ready and proficient with whatever their assigned task is.
And we're learning a lot of lessons on our industrial base side from the war in Ukraine right now. And a lot of lessons about the conduct of war today. Are we learning anything about the healthcare system and what we ought to be thinking about from what's happening in the war in Ukraine? Anybody?
If I may, I'll just quickly say, having just been with the Ukrainian Surgeon General, absolutely. So what they have found first and foremost is they're in the kind of conflict we will likely be in. In the absence of air superiority, contested logistics, you must have a functioning system that's integrated. And this gets back to Senator Fisher's question about the National Disaster Medical System. They're also learning the importance of supply chains. When we looked at this at the Joint Staff, we found that a significant percentage of the pharmaceuticals in our deployable assemblages actually rely on ingredients from countries that may or may not be willing to continue to provide those in the next conflict. Same song, next verse with medical equipment. I urge you, as I said in my written statement, to require the department to give you an accounting for our vulnerabilities in that area and a plan to address them. There are ways to do that. We need a strong push, I would submit, to actually accomplish that.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Dr. Cannon and Dr. Robb, do you want to elaborate on what Dr. Friedrichs said about USAID?
Sure, that's out of my domain, so I don't have any specific comments.
Very well then, yes.
I would concur, one, with his comments, but number two, it's mostly out of my domain currently.
All right, thank you very much. Senator Cotton.
General Friedrichs, I'd like to continue with the answer you just gave to Senator Shaheen about our dependence on other countries for drugs and precursors, specifically Communist China. The United States relies heavily on Communist China for basic drugs and so-called APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients. Providers obviously need this not just in the civilian world, but in the military world, especially to treat combat casualties. China, for instance, has 80% of the global supply chain of antibiotics. How could Communist China use this dependence of ours to its advantage if there were a major conflict in the Pacific?
Thank you very much, Senator Cotton. And I think we've seen examples of this with rare minerals and other things that China largely controls the supply chain for, in that they will choose to titrate that supply chain based on their satisfaction or dissatisfaction with those trying to purchase those items. I had the great privilege in my last role of working with India, the EU, Japan, and Korea on a consortium in which we began to identify ways to leverage new technologies to change and to broaden our supply chains. And I encourage this committee to direct the Department of Defense, in partnership with the Department of Health and Human Services, to continue exploring those options. What we found was, in many cases, as in the case of antibiotics that are based on penicillin, the Japanese have already made a tremendous investment in the ability to produce those APIs within Japan. We should be partnering with them and creating an environment in which at least the DOD and the VA purchase from Japan to help sustain that production base and ensure that we have the access that we need. There are many more examples. I touched on some of them in my written statement, but there are ways to mitigate this.
And your answer to Senator Shaheen said that Congress should push the Department of Defense to catalog all of these dependencies. It sounds like you're saying that we also need to push to eliminate or at least significantly curtail these dependencies as well. Is that right?
Absolutely.
And you mentioned 4 different sourcing options, South Korea, Japan, the EU, and India. Those first 3 are advanced industrial democracies just like ours. If they can produce these items like acetaminophen or ibuprofen or penicillin at a reasonable cost, surely the United States could do so as well, right?
I believe that is the case, and what we found is that, particularly in these countries, they've created an environment in which it was financially possible for companies to produce these items within their country. We have not done that here in the United States, but a thoughtful industrial policy that was focused on resilience and national security, as well as economic security and health security, could do that for us as well.
It's fair to say that between the 2 of them, the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs sure does have a lot of purchasing power to create a domestic market for the production of these fairly basic and long-standing medicines, right?
Absolutely. About 8% of the market, and it gets back to Senator Shaheen's point about continuing resolutions and predictability. If companies know that they have a predictable demand signal, they'll build to it. If they have an episodic or random demand signal, they'll let somebody else deal with that.
General Robb, I've noticed you nodding your head vigorously, so please get off your chest everything you wanted to add to General Friedrichs' answers.
Yes, I also, and I know, I'm sure you're aware, and this has been in the direction from questions asked by our Congress. The Center for Health Services Research at the Uniformed Services University has been tasked with, along with the Defense Logistics Agency, to catalog and specifically look at what and define the problem. What is the Department of Defense's reliance on the medicines that we have talked about that are primarily sourced from China and from India, and which would then help what I would call inform the decisions a way ahead of whether you, what I call it, ally shore, or near shore or onshore, as Dr. Friedrichs discussed in looking at a way forward. But they are creating that, what's the data to drive the decision and the investment. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen, both for your answers. It's long been the case that the Department of Defense, acting at congressional direction, has mandated the domestic purchase of many uniform items. So I think surely we should make sure that our troops have the medicines they need to stay healthy or to recover as needed.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Kaine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I want to particularly recognize Dr. Cannon. I know you're very well prepared for this hearing today because one of the leaders that's with you, Kristen Malloy, used to be on my staff, and she made sure I seemed a lot smarter than I was at any hearing that I attended. I think I want to focus all of your attention on the workforce issues because I'm on the health, education, labor, pension too, and if I go to my hospitals and healthcare providers, they're singing the blues about workforce, tight labor market, difficulty hiring and retaining folks. I went to the grand opening of a new VA clinic in the Fredericksburg area 2 Fridays ago, and we built it to the tune of about $350 million. And we built this state-of-the-art clinic with one step down from a hospital because there were multiple clinics in the area, and veterans were having to go from pillar to post to get care rather than a single place. But when we opened it, and I was there for the opening, I had staff say we're on a skeleton crew. The 3 VA hospitals in Virginia, Salem, Richmond, and Hampton are laying people off. There's hiring freezes. There's plans for even more layoffs. And so the estimates I was getting at that grand opening is they're probably 20 to 50% staffed. There's another sizable clinic similar that's going to open in Chesapeake, supposed to, on April 11th. If it does open on time, I'm suspecting that it will be a similar thing. And you saw the announcements about more cuts coming in the VA. What is your vision for how you've talked a little bit about the need to be more integrated between DOD facilities and VA facilities, but then also on the civilian side, what is your vision for how we equip our civilian system to provide a surge capacity or backup capacity when we need it to perform well in combat situations? Please, Dr. Cannon.
Senator, thank you for your very insightful comments and questions. I am a veteran. I get my care at our VA in Philadelphia. My wife is a primary care physician and takes care of veterans. So I can speak to your comments about the VA from that perspective. I do have a role at Penn Medicine as the Assistant Dean for Veteran Affairs for Penn Medicine, but I'm quite new in that role and still learning the ropes. So I'll speak more from my end user experience. I would say that certainly there are opportunities for synergy. The partnerships between VA facilities and academic medical centers, I think, have been partially realized, but in this sort of urgent situation we find ourselves in, we need truly a whole of society approach, and where there can be market synergy, where there can be economies of scale, we should aggressively pursue that. I know that our CEO, Kevin Mahoney, has made overtures to the VA, and there have been agreements signed between the VA. I don't have detailed knowledge about that and where that stands, but I think there is an opportunity, and we should push for that. And as a veteran who receives my care, I hope that we can continue to deliver excellent care through better synergy.
How about Dr. Friedrichs and Dr. Robb?
Thank you, Senator Kane, and that is a beautiful facility, and it'll be tragic if it sits there empty while veterans are unable to access care because of shortages of medical professionals in the VA, in the DOD, and in the civilian sector. We're in a less than zero-sum game right now, and that is both a health security issue but also a national security issue. The first recommendation I would make to this committee, direct that the Department of Defense does not close any more of our military training programs. For decades, the military training programs have been one of the pipelines that when people eventually left the military, which all of us do, they go to the civilian sector. We cannot afford to close any more training programs when we have so many shortages of doctors and nurses and dentists and other things. The second, I implore this committee, in the NDA, direct the DOD and in partnership with the appropriate VA oversight committees, the Veterans Administration, to come back with a plan, starting with the DC market, to integrate the two systems. We've talked about this since I was a major. I moved here in 1997 and we were talking about this. It's time to stop talking and start doing it. We can't afford to keep talking about this problem. That hospital in the VA here is ancient. It's got to be replaced. We just finished a $1 billion upgrade at Walter Reed. Why in the world are you not demanding that we come back with a plan to do that? It is more efficient and it helps to pool the resources. The third point, and the most important one in your health committee role, is we must address these pipelines as both a health security and an economic security and a national security concern. As long as the pipelines continue to be insufficient to need, there's no way that any of these problems are going to get fixed. And I think you have a unique opportunity to help bring that into both committees. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. And Dr. Robb, I'll ask that question for the record because I'm now out of time. I yield back to the chair.
All right. Actually, these witnesses will not be taking questions for the record, but I'll let you follow up for 45 seconds.
Dr. Robb, then could you approach that workforce integration question too? Thanks.
Yes, and I'll go back to where we can share resources, and I will foot stomp. We have very many successful joint DOD and VA partnerships. Travis Air Force Base is a great example where the actual VA is inside of David Grant Medical Center, share staffs, but more importantly, share patients. We have other where we're co-located community-based outpatient centers that feed patients into like Anchorage, Alaska. We see that down there at Naval Pensacola. So those opportunities, because usually what happens is we want access to critical care patients, okay, for our proficiency, and the VA wants access to resources, which is either excess capacity on space or in staff. And so I think that continued movement forward, not always one size fits all, but that is very, very important. Much like the VA is at all the academic health centers, I think the Department of Defense, especially in our 6 or 8 strategic places, need to have strategic VA and strategic MilSIV partnerships, sharing staff. And I will quickly say, not only do we learn from the military, the military learn from the civilian opportunities. During OIF and OEF, actually, the American College of Surgeons made sure that they were with us so they could learn firsthand, real time, on how we were treating. So it is a mutually synergistic relationship.
Thank you, Dr. Robb. Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to follow right along that same line because I think what you're laying out is basic common sense when it comes to the integration of these two systems. My question is why is it that when we have what is considered to be excellent care with the military system, the MHS involved, and then we have to transition these young men and women as they leave the armed services into a VA facility in which we start all over again? We have different ways of communicating, and in fact, let me just ask this. In your experiences, how well do we integrate the transfer of information from the MHS back into the VA systems today?
Senator, I can take a crack at that. I believe you're spot on. My experience in transitioning from the DOD to the VA was more of a lukewarm handoff than a warm handoff. I had to sort of navigate my way to the VA. I now have closed that gap, and I get my care there, as I mentioned. But it's not a smooth process. So why is it still the case that the two healthcare delivery systems are so partitioned? I think you have to go back to ancient history almost in our country. And if you look at Secretary Gates' comments about his experience as Secretary of Defense, he said the one department that gave me the most fits was the Department of the VA. So there are historic challenges. The VA wants to do it their way. Understandably, most of us do want to do it our way, but I think there are clear opportunities and a clear demand signal to break down those barriers and realize opportunities for synergy. So I think we can do that.
I think the focus should be on whether or not we're delivering for the veteran and not necessarily the survivability of the VA itself. And I think that sometimes gets mixed up.
Yes,
I'm just curious, gentlemen, we've talked about trauma centers, we've talked about the integration or an integrated healthcare system and so forth. We're not right now in we're not at the same degree of activity and intensity with regard to battlefield casualties as we were just a few years ago, and therefore the opportunity for these surgeons, these battlefield surgeons and others to actually learn right now is probably not as great. How do we keep the intensity or the capabilities, the training, how do we keep that up to date when we don't have those opportunities? And I'm not going to say that they're good opportunities. I'm glad that we're not in them. But how do you allow that surgeon to keep those skills up to speed when you don't have the types of casualties that you have on a battlefield that we were experiencing for a number of years?
Take care of sick patients, sir. There's an analog between taking care of a patient who has bladder cancer and needs to have their bladder removed and taking care of a patient who's just had a gunshot wound to the abdomen, needs to have their bladder reconstructed. We need our military medics taking care of sick patients. They do that at hospitals that are well-staffed and well-resourced to take care of sick patients. And so, that's what we have done historically to maintain the proficiency of surgeons or of critical care nurses or of medical logistics staff, is keep them busy during peacetime taking care of sick patients. It's not a perfect analog, but that is the best surrogate, and that requires resourcing the system, making sure that sick patients can get in the door and get the care they need. And to your point about the VA, I would just say I applaud the VA for accelerating moving forward with their electronic health record, because that is going to be the secret sauce that enables greater sharing between the two departments and will enable us to track patients from the day they join the military to the day they take their last breath and really learn how to improve both systems.
Is the current system that you use integratable with the VA's new proposed medical records healthcare system?
So I am not an expert on the VA system. When I left the movie, they were looking at purchasing the same system that the DOD had purchased. I hope that those with oversight responsibilities will insist that the two systems are integratable, because technologically, there's nothing to prevent that. I mean, civilian healthcare systems integrate Epic and Cerner all the time, or McKesson and Epic. There should be no technological reason why we can't do that.
Thank you. General Robb, anything to add to that?
I would share what Dr. Friedrichs said. In fact, what I was excited about is I've had the opportunity for family members to be in civilian hospitals, and they are able to reach into it and see Genesis now. And so they know the health care that my family members have been getting in the military. I know that is absolutely been the vision between the Department of Defense and the Department of VA, and I believe that is still what I would call the true north. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rounds. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank you for having this hearing, very timely and important. Secondly, I want to associate myself with Senator Cotton's comments about a sort of Berry amendment for drugs. The idea that we have to buy made in America shirts for our troops, but we're worried about the availability of crucial drugs. It seems to me that's something that should be pursued. We could even call it the King Cotton Amendment, but I'll pass on that. Also, Mr. Chairman, before getting into the questions, and these witnesses wouldn't have the answers, but I think in light of this hearing, the committee should make an inquiry about whether there have been firings or early retirements encouraged within the medical facilities at the Defense Department, because we know there's a lot of that going around, and I'd like to know whether that's happening in the Defense Health Agency. Secondly, there's the impact of the continuing resolution. That's certainly not going to help this situation in terms of maintaining demand signals, continuity, pilot programs. All of that is gone in a continuing resolution. For the first time in my knowledge, I think the first time in American history, we're faced with a year-long continuing resolution, which basically vitiates the entire budget process. Okay. What we're really talking about, it seems to me, is surge capacity. And it's impractical to maintain a capacity within the Defense Department or even Defense plus VA for the kind of casualties that would be generated in a significant conflict. Therefore, I see no other alternative than a cooperative surge agreement with the private sector. That's where that's where capacity is, even though that's fairly limited. But Dr. Friedrichs, isn't that really what we're talking about here? Is how do we deal with a conflict way beyond what we're seeing now within the current capacity? Defense Health Agency couldn't do it. VA couldn't do it. It's got to be it's got to be relationships, and shouldn't we have those relationships in advance so this isn't something that we scramble to do as we did during COVID, for example?
Senator King, I could not agree more strongly, and I'll point out that.
Show that what he just
Thank you, sir. So, in the Cold War, we had what was called the Integrated CONUS Medical Operation Plan, which it was essentially what you just described. It was our shared commitment as a nation to care for our nation's casualties if and when our nation went to war. That depended on the National Disaster Medical System as part of the integrating function between the federal and the civilian healthcare system. The NDMS has been allowed to attrit. I echo the recommendations to reauthorize the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act, because that in part enables the NDMS. But I implore you to go further. The Integrated CONUS Medical Operation Plan needs to be updated, and we started that work when I was the Joint Staff Surgeon, and it's continuing today. Having the NDMS in name is not sufficient. We actually have to build out the numbers by community of what beds would be available, who would take them.
With pre-existing conditions and analysis of needs.
Yes.
And I just wonder if the Pentagon has war gamed this issue. They
did while I was the Joint. Absolutely, sir. We actually did a war game on this that we hosted first when I was the Transportation Command Surgeon and again when I was the Joint Staff Surgeon. And what we found was, just as you said, it can't be done unless it's a whole-of-a-nation effort. And the only way to get to that point is if we do much more detailed planning. Taking down funding for state and local readiness officials, for example, is not going to help them do more planning or preparing. We need to work together to build and flesh out that plan, and we must bring industry into that. The defense industrial base provides the equipment. The health industrial base addresses the points that you made.
And we have an analog in Transcom, which has agreements with the private sector, both in terms of airplanes and ships. In the case of an emergency, that's where our surge capacity is. So it seems to me, I mean, here we are talking about it, but I think there needs to be some very specific good new looks at this relationship in order to be ready. So again, we're not scrambling. Dr. Robb, you're nodding. I take it you agree.
Yes, I would absolutely concur. And again, I keep going back to the same theme: is we've got to build up those 6 to 8 to 10 strategic military treatment facilities. We have to resource them, and then you create the already established civilian, military VA partnerships. And then you just keep expanding that ring. But you have to have those relationships codified and in place, and that's what Dr. Friedrichs is talking about. You can't just all of a sudden, when it kicks off, pick up the phone and say, how's it going?
You got to have them in place before the crisis hits.
Absolutely.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Senator Budd. Catch your breath.
Feel free to filibuster.
Major General, in your opening statement, whether here or able to watch it on the closed circuit, you identify the importance of the relationship between the military health system and the defense logistics enterprise. So should deterrence fail and the war break out in the Indo-Pacific, there are undeniable logistics constraints, particularly given the geography of Indo-PACOM. The logistics of replenishing medical supplies and evacuating wounded service members could make all the difference in reducing service member casualties. You provide a number of recommendations in your opening statement to address these concerns, including a number of reports and studies, so thank you for that. So what can our military health system do in the short term, like immediately, to address logistical constraints, and how can DOD leverage medical innovation to address some of those constraints?
Thank you very much, Senator. I think the most immediate recommendation that I included in my written statement was that whenever we contemplate an operation or we're updating plans, we do a medical feasibility assessment, very similar to the medical logistics, or to the logistics feasibility assessment that the Joint Staff J4 does. We need to ensure that we are informing our combatant commanders about what is and is not possible. That is something that can be done very easily. The longer answer to your question gets back to the discussion that we were just having about partnering with industry, both on the equipment and pharmaceutical side and on the healthcare delivery side. We have the Civilian Reserve Air Fleet that allows us to commit money to ensure that we have industry partners willing to provide aircraft and support when we need it. We have no such analog in the healthcare space, even though we know, as multiple senators pointed out this morning, that there's insufficient capacity in the DOD and in the VA to care for our casualties. The NDMS currently is a voluntary system in which hospitals can say, yeah, okay. And then when we call them, they say, I'm busy today, I'm not going to participate. We actually need to codify a system, as we've done with other industrial partners, in which there's a commitment and an understanding of how the reimbursement would work. The last point that I would make on that going forward is, in supplemental planning for future operations, we have to build in that cost. There is no question, if we're bringing back thousands of casualties, as Colonel Cannon described, that is going to displace care and it's going to increase cost at hospitals. We have to plan for that. That's why this whole planning effort, the Integrated CONUS Medical Operations Plan, for which Northcom is the lead, in partnership with industry, state, local, and HHS officials, is so important so we can bring back the requirements for funding and the challenges that we'll need congressional help to address.
Thank you. Following up on that, you said we need to codify that. Do you have the language ready, or has that been written in a way that we could review either individually or as a committee?
Senator, I took the liberty of including an attachment with suggested language just in case anyone wanted to do that.
We'll read it in a few moments. Thank you. Mr. Robb, as you know, the department relies on a mix of military personnel, federal civilians, and contractors to carry out its mission. Talk to me about the roles of physician extenders such as registered nurses, and what role do physician extenders play in ensuring the readiness of the broader force, and what challenges do you see to retention of physician extenders?
Thank you for that question, Senator. I think it's key that what we are the same issues of what I call proficiency and currency that exists for physicians exists for our physician extenders. And the Army does a great job, especially in the way they've manned and equipped their fighting forces of using those physician extenders all the way down to the corpsmen to the fullest extent of their capabilities. And so I would argue, as we have these discussions about medical readiness and about our ability to care for what we call critical wartime specialties, we must remember trauma is a small percentage of that, but the majority of the care that is applied to our fighting forces comes from our primary care providers, in which would be PAs, nurse practitioners, general practitioners, family physicians. So we must ensure that they also have the critical thinking skills and the opportunity to practice at the top of their game.
Thank you all for the whole panel. Chairman?
Senator Budd, yes, indeed, in looking at the statements which have all been admitted to the record by unanimous consent, I see on page 14 of Dr. Friedrichs' prepared testimony, attachment 1, suggested National Defense Authorization Act language. So we do appreciate him acting as an uncompensated legislative staffer for this committee. We appreciate that. And thanks for the question. Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Friedrichs, good morning, and thank you, all of you, for being here today. General Friedrichs, in a recent war game brief to Congress in November of 2024, a hypothetical conflict in the Indo-Pacific resulted in 3,000 U.S. casualties in 3 weeks and 10,000 across the entire conflict. And I'm kind of following up on Senator Budd's line of questioning here. These numbers are higher than anything we've seen since the Korean War. And as severely injured service members transition through the care system and make their way back to the United States for treatment, I'm concerned that the number of DoD providers capable of handling trauma will be grossly insufficient. So given that, we're going to need to surge capacity, potentially found in the U.S. hospital system and VA hospitals, so meaning civilian hospitals, VA hospitals. What concerns do you have with relying on U.S. civilian and VA hospitals to provide this trauma care to our service members?
Thank you very much, Senator Kelly. And I'd start by saying, even before we get patients back to the United States, in the past, we've relied on our allies and partners to help care for our casualties. And I am deeply concerned if we sever or degrade those relationships, we will need to rewrite our plans, and the demand on the U.S. healthcare system will be even greater. To your point about the U.S. healthcare system, the Integrated CONUS Medical Operations Plan that we updated in 1998 and then didn't look at until 2020 is the plan that describes how we will surge capacity. But a key part of that gets back to some of the discussions we've had earlier. There have to be doctors and nurses and pharmacists and all the other staff to do that. And I implore that we continue to look at the pipelines that produce those medics as well as the facilities in which they work. We had briefly chatted about the opportunity for a medical equivalent to the civilian reserve air fleet that we use to ensure access to civilian aircraft when needed. I believe we need some similar construct in the healthcare system where we partner with industry and recognize that during surge moments, there's a plan and there's money available for us to be able to leverage their staff and their facilities.
Is there a plan?
There is a plan. We wrote the first version of that before I retired, and they are working on an update to that. But it would benefit from additional congressional oversight to ensure that it's on track and it does not get diverted by bureaucratic buffoonery.
Are there current efforts in the relationship building with these hospitals?
The Defense Health Agency is tasked to have that outreach, and as I've met with hospital CEOs and system owners, there's certainly an opportunity to do more in that space. We must view the healthcare industry the same way we view the aviation industry or the missile-producing industry, as our partners. We cannot take care of America's casualties without those partners.
Could you talk to the value in the 2 Navy hospital ships? I don't know if anybody here is prepared to talk about, because I think there's enough effort underway to replace those. There's also the training ships for the state maritime academies that I think also could serve a role. I visited one at the Philly shipyard a few weeks ago, had an operating room on board. Is that part of the system as you envision it?
Yes, absolutely. The hospital ships are integral to our plans for a large-scale combat operation, and the 2 ships we have are some of the oldest ships afloat. They have to be replaced.
I think there's a plan to replace them now. Can you speak to how that is going, if you know?
So I pushed incredibly hard for that plan as the Joint Staff Surgeon against intense opposition that we should spend the money in other places. I would defer to the Navy for the latest update on it because they can give you the most current plan. But my understanding is that we're still years away from having the replacement ships available. So we'll have to extend the current ships. And I believe the last update I received, which is dated, was through 2035. But we do need that additional replacement funding to replace those aged ships.
All right. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kelly. Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we need a medical healthcare system that works in wartime, but the one we have is failing us in peacetime. And I think we need to do better on this. Fixing TRICARE's prescription drug benefit is part of that. Since 2009, TRICARE has outsourced to Express Scripts, a massive pharmacy benefit manager, PBM. The Defense Health Agency, DHA, pays Express Scripts to negotiate with pharmacies deciding where service members can pick up their prescriptions and what price they're going to pay. But Express Scripts also owns Accredo, a massive pharmacy that participates in TRICARE. And DHA has been allowing all kinds of self-dealing between these 2 entities. Here's one. DHA used to require Express Scripts to maintain a network of 50,000 pharmacies. But in 2021, Express Scripts negotiated that down to 35,000 pharmacies. Then they turned around and told thousands of pharmacies that they don't own, either to take money-losing terms or get kicked out of TRICARE. General Robb, you used to oversee the TRICARE network before this gaming started. Do you have any idea how many pharmacies have left just since 2022?
And I have been out, Senator Warren, I've been out of that business since 2016.
Okay.
So,
I just wondered if you happen to know how many had left. I'll take a note.
No, ma'am, I do not.
Well, it's over 13,000 pharmacies have left this network, and most of them are independent pharmacies, community pharmacies. That has forced 400,000 service members and their families to find new pharmacies, and many of them have been pushed to the Express Scripts-owned Accredo. Even worse, Express Scripts has set up Accredo as the primary off-base pharmacy where military families can fill specialty drug prescriptions. You know, these are the really expensive cancer drugs, rheumatoid arthritis drugs that make up over half of the $8 billion in TRICARE prescription drug spending. So it's a lot of money here. It doesn't end there. As we speak, Express Scripts is facing a whistleblower lawsuit that alleges the company systematically overfilled TRICARE prescriptions at Accredo, saddling DOD with, quote, billions of dollars in excess dispensing fees and drug resupplies. And this isn't a surprise. Express Scripts has been found to massively overfill and overpay for prescriptions at Accredo, which they own, in other government programs. So, General Robb, since last year, an audit uncovered that Express Scripts was leveraging its contract with the West Virginia Public Employees System to send inflated payments to Accredo for expensive specialty drugs, in some cases inflating the price by 100-fold more than the cost of dispensing exactly the same drug at a competing pharmacy. I imagine you think this kind of taxpayer overcharging is unacceptable. Is that fair, General Robb?
I would agree with that. Would be unfair. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. DHA is supposed to audit Express Scripts pharmacy data to make sure that that same thing isn't happening at TRICARE. But DHA said it hadn't completed an audit because DHA had, quote, no concerns about data accuracy. You know, talk about being asleep at the wheel here. In just the first quarter of 2023, Express Scripts dispensed 70,000 specialty drug prescriptions at Accredo, but the company only reported about 40,000 to DHA. In other words, Accredo failed to report nearly half of the expensive specialty drugs dispensed at its own pharmacy, which were paid for by DHA. So they get the money, but they don't tell DHA what's going on here. General Robb, after completing their investigation, GAO sensibly recommended that DHA periodically audit Express Scripts reported data for accuracy, which, by the way, is already required in the contract. So this is telling them basically to follow through on the contract. Do you agree with GAO's recommendation?
I would agree that they need to follow what is the business policy and what is the contractual requirements. Yes, ma'am.
You know, I just want to say, and I'll close up here, DHA is paying Express Scripts billions of taxpayer dollars to manage the TRICARE benefit and negotiate with itself. And DHA isn't even bothering to check the books. I think that everyone in this room agrees that Express Scripts ought to pass an audit, and that ought to be required in this year's NDAA. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren.
Mr. Chairman, may I add a comment to that? Is there time?
You certainly may, yes.
Thank you very much. I would hold up the Veterans Health Administration's exemplary mail order program, which has worked for years, as an opportunity, again, going back to this concept of how do we deliver better care and, where possible, do it more efficiently. There's a real opportunity for this committee, in partnership with the appropriate VA oversight committees, to direct a comparison of the two systems and then bring back recommendations for the best practices between the two. Pharmaceuticals are growing in cost, and that is not going to change. But this is an area in which the Veterans Health Administration actually has done this well for years, with high patient satisfaction, and more importantly, the patients get the meds they need when they need them. There's a real opportunity to learn from the VA here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Senator Warren. Mr. Ranking Member, anything more?
Just let me commend the witnesses, and you've given us lots to think about and lots to do. And so we appreciate that. Thank you very much.
We are indebted to you and grateful to all three of you. Thank you very much, and this concludes the hearing.